There are moments in history so improbable, so defiant of every reasonable explanation, that they force us to stop and reconsider what we think we know about human beings and what they are capable of. This is one of those moments. The year is 1429. The Kingdom of France is bleeding. For nearly a century, the English and their Burgundian allies have torn through the French heartland with calculated brutality. Towns have been burned to the ground, harvests have been destroyed, entire populations have been displaced. The man who holds the title of King of France, Charles VII, known behind his back as the uncrowned king, rules from a diminished court, doubted even by his own advisors, and lacking the courage or the resources to turn the tide of the war. Into this world of smoke, starvation, and despair walks a girl, a peasant, a teenager who has never held a sword in battle, a girl from a village most people in Paris have never heard of. Her name is Jeanne d'Arc, and what she is about to do will shake the foundations of medieval Europe. This is not a story about miracles, though some will call it that. This is a story about a human being, fierce, determined, deeply complex, who decided that the voice inside her was real, that her mission was real, and that she would die before she abandoned it. And she did. This is the true story of Joan of Arc.
To understand Joan of Arc, you must first understand the world that made her. And to understand that world, you must travel to a small village in northeastern France, tucked along the banks of the Meuse River, surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills. The village is called Domrémy. It is, by any measure, an unremarkable place. The houses are simple, timber, stone, and thatch. The streets, if you can call them that, are unpaved and muddy in the spring. The people who live here are farmers and shepherds, men and women who rise before dawn and labor until darkness forces them indoors. The closest thing Domrémy has to a center of power is its small stone church, dedicated to Saint Remy, where the villagers gather each Sunday in a ritual as ancient as the village itself. It is here, in this humble setting, that Joan of Arc is born around the year 1412, though even that date is uncertain, a reminder of how little the world initially cared to record her existence. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, is a respected man in the village, a small landowner and local official. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, is a woman of deep faith who raises her children with a piety that will come to define Joan's entire life. Growing up, Joan learns what every girl in Domrémy learns: how to sew, how to spin, how to tend to animals. She does not learn to read or write. That is not a skill the daughters of peasants are expected to possess. What she does learn, deeply and intimately, is prayer. She attends church with a devotion that even her neighbors remark upon. She fasts, she confesses, she believes with every fiber of her being that God is watching. And then, one summer afternoon, when Joan is around 13 years old, something happens in her father's garden that will alter the course of her life and the course of French history. She hears a voice. In her own words, recorded years later during her trial, she describes it this way: a voice coming from her right, accompanied by a bright light. She is terrified at first, then the fear gives way to something else, a feeling she will later describe as great joy. The voice, she will say, belongs to Saint Michael, the archangel of war. Over the following years, she will hear other voices as well, those of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, and all of them tell her the same thing: France must be saved, the English must be driven out, and she, Joan, the shepherd girl from Domrémy, is the one who must do it. For several years, she tells no one. She keeps this secret buried inside her, while the war outside her village grows ever more terrible. The English and their Burgundian allies tighten their grip on northern France. The English-backed claimant to the French throne, the young Henry VI of England, is recognized as King of France in Paris. The true heir, Charles VII, retreats further and further south,
his authority evaporating with each passing season. By 1428, the city of Orléans, one of the last major strongholds of the French crown, is under siege. If Orléans falls, the war is effectively over. France as an independent kingdom will cease to exist. Joan is 16 years old, and the voices are growing louder. In the winter of 1429, she takes a step so audacious it defies description. She presents herself to Robert de Baudricourt, the commander of the local French garrison in the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, and tells him plainly she needs an escort to travel to the royal court of Charles VII at Chinon. She has been sent by God. She will save France. She will crown the king. Baudricourt laughs her away, twice. On the third visit, something shifts. Perhaps it is the conviction in her eyes. Perhaps it is the reports of a prophecy circulating through France that the kingdom lost by a woman would be saved by a virgin from the borderlands of Lorraine. Whatever the reason, Baudricourt relents. He gives her an escort of 6 men. He gives her a horse, and on a cold February morning in 1429, Joan of Arc rides out of Domrémy toward the royal court of Charles VII, toward destiny, toward glory, and toward a fate she cannot yet fully see.
The journey to Chinon takes 11 days. 11 days of riding through hostile territory, through territory held by Burgundian forces, through forests where enemy soldiers patrol. Joan travels disguised, wearing men's clothing to avoid detection. It is the first of many times she will defy the expectations of what a woman is supposed to be and do. When she arrives at the royal court of Chinon, she faces her first great test. Charles VII, cautious and deeply suspicious by nature, decides to put her to a test of his own. He hides himself among his courtiers, dressing himself not as a king, but as an ordinary nobleman, while placing another man in the royal seat. Joan walks into the great hall. She has never seen Charles VII before. She scans the room, and then she walks directly to him, the man in the crowd, and kneels before him. "Gentle Dauphin," she says, "I am Jeanne the maid, and the King of Heaven sends word through me that you will be anointed and crowned at Reims." The court is stunned. Charles is shaken. He speaks with her privately for an extended time. What was said in that room was never fully recorded. But when he emerges, something in his demeanor has changed. He orders Joan to be examined by a panel of theologians at Poitiers. For 3 weeks, they question her, probe her, test the sincerity of her faith and the coherence of her mission. Their conclusion? She shows every sign of a good Christian. There is no evidence of evil. She can be trusted. Joan is given a suit of white armor. She is given a horse, a war horse, not the modest animal she rode from Domrémy, and she is given an army. On April 29, 1429, Joan of Arc enters the besieged city of Orleans. The reception she receives is extraordinary. The citizens of the city, who have endured months of siege and starvation, line the streets to see her. They reach out to touch her horse. They weep. In a city that has nearly given up hope, she is hope made visible. A teenage girl in gleaming armor, carrying not a sword, but a white banner embroidered with the image of Christ and the words, "Jesus, Maria." The military commanders are skeptical. Some are outright hostile. Joan is not a general. She has no training in siege warfare, no experience of battlefield tactics. But she has something else, an absolute, unshakable certainty that God is with her. And in the world of medieval warfare, where morale can be as decisive as any weapon, that certainty proves to be a force of its own. In the days that follow, Joan participates directly in the assault on the English fortifications surrounding Orleans. She is wounded by an arrow through the shoulder during the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles.
a wound serious enough to make any soldier retreat. Joan pauses only long enough to have the arrow removed, and then she returns to the fight. Hours later, the fortress falls. Within 9 days of her arrival, the siege of Orleans is broken. A military operation that experienced French commanders had been unable to resolve for 7 months is concluded by a teenage girl in under 2 weeks. The news spreads through France like fire, and through England like a cold wave of dread. The victories continue through the summer. Joan leads French forces in a series of battles along the Loire Valley, defeating the English at Jargeau, at Mons-sur-Loire, at Beaugency, and at Patay, where she effectively destroys one of England's elite formations, the English longbowmen, the very force that had made England so feared on French soil. At Patay, the English lose over 2,000 men. It is one of the most decisive French victories of the entire Hundred Years' War. On July 17, 1429, in the great Cathedral of Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronations, Charles VII is crowned King of France. Joan stands beside him during the ceremony, holding her white banner. She will later say that her banner had shared in the labor, so it was right that it should share in the honor. She is 17 years old. But here, at the very peak of her triumph, the shadows begin to gather. Charles VII is crowned, the immediate crisis is past, and the king's advisors, men of ambition and political calculation, begin to question the role of this strange girl from Lorraine. Joan wants to continue the campaign, to march on Paris, to drive out the English entirely, to finish what has been started. The king's council hesitates. They prefer negotiation. They prefer caution. Joan is given half-hearted support for an assault on Paris in September 1429. It fails. She is wounded again, this time in the thigh. The king orders a retreat. For Joan, it is the beginning of a slow, terrible unraveling. At this point, we must pause and ask you something. Having followed Joan from the fields of Domrémy to the Cathedral of Reims, having seen what one human being, armed nothing but belief and courage, is capable of, what do you make of her story so far? What, in your view, was the source of her extraordinary power? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you think.
The France that Joan of Arc had given so much to save was not, in the end, the France that would save her. What followed the coronation of Charles VII was a story not of gratitude, but of abandonment. Quiet, calculated, and ultimately fatal. Through the winter and spring of 1430, Joan continued to fight, leading smaller military operations with diminishing royal support. The king's advisors were negotiating truces with Burgundy behind her back. The momentum she had created was being carefully, deliberately allowed to dissipate. On May 23, 1430, during a skirmish near the town of Compiègne, Joan's position is cut off by a Burgundian force. Her troops retreat back into the town. Joan, characteristically, is among the last to fall back. The drawbridge is raised before she can cross it. She is pulled from her horse by a Burgundian soldier and taken prisoner. Charles VII makes no meaningful effort to rescue her. No ransom is offered. No prisoner exchange is attempted. The girl who had crowned him king is left in Burgundian hands, and the Burgundians, allies of England, know exactly what to do with her. They sell her to the English for 10,000 livres tournois. She is transferred to English custody and held in the castle of Bouvreuil in the Norman city of Rouen, deep within English-controlled territory. What happens next is one of the most grotesque judicial proceedings in European history. The English need Joan dead, but they cannot simply execute her. That would make her a martyr of war, a military prisoner killed by her captors. They need her condemned by the church. They need her labeled a heretic, a witch, a servant of the devil rather than of God.
In that way, her victories can be reframed not as miracles, but as the work of dark forces, and Charles VII's legitimacy, resting in part on the divine sanction she represented, can be undermined. The trial that begins in January 1431 is presided over by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man with deep personal and political ties to the English cause. He is, by any honest assessment, not a neutral arbiter of justice. He is an instrument of a predetermined outcome. Joan faces her accusers alone. She has no lawyer, she has no advisor. She is surrounded by men of learning and ecclesiastical authority, men who have spent their entire careers mastering the intricacies of canon law and theological argument, and she answers them with a clarity and a courage that leaves her interrogators visibly frustrated. When asked whether she believes she is in God's grace, a trap question, since to say yes would be arrogant, to say no would be to confess to sin, Joan answers with an answer that has echoed through centuries. If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there. She is subjected to weeks of interrogation. She is questioned about her voices, her clothing, her visions, her refusal to submit to the church's authority above what she understands to be God's direct command. She is kept in chains in a military prison, guarded by English soldiers, a profound violation of church law, which required female prisoners to be held in an ecclesiastical prison under the supervision of nuns. In April 1431, exhausted and ill, Joan makes a brief and partial recantation. She signs a document whose contents she may not have fully understood, given her inability to read. Days later, she retracts it. She declares again that her voices were real, that her mission came from God, that she will not deny what she knows to be true. The court condemns her as a relapsed heretic. The sentence is death. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc is led to the old market square in Rouen. She is 19 years old. A crowd of thousands has gathered. She is dressed in a penitent's robe. A tall mitre is placed on her head, inscribed with the words heretic, relapse, apostate, idolater. She is bound to a stake atop a tall pyre. Before the fire is lit, she asks for a cross. An English soldier, moved by some impulse of mercy or guilt, fashions a small cross from 2 sticks and gives it to her. She holds it against her chest. A priest holds up a crucifix before her eyes. The last word heard from Joan of Arc as the flames rose around her was a single word, repeated over and over until it was silenced: Jesus. The English executioner later said, and this detail, recorded by witnesses, has stayed with historians for 6 centuries, that he was afraid his soul was damned. He had burned a saint. He may have been right. 25 years after her death, Pope Calixtus III ordered a new investigation into Joan's trial. The proceedings were examined, the witnesses were interviewed, the legal manipulations, the procedural violations, the political pressures that had shaped the verdict, all of it was laid bare. In July 1456, the original conviction was formally annulled. Every charge against Joan of Arc was declared false. Her reputation was restored. Her name was cleared. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her. She is today Saint Joan of Arc, the patron saint of France, and one of the most recognized figures in the entire history of Western civilization. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Joan of Arc is not her canonization, not the statues, not the 500 years of plays and paintings and films made in her honor. The most extraordinary thing is simpler and more human than all of that. She was a girl who believed she had been called to do something impossible, and she did it. She walked into the courts of kings and generals with nothing but her certainty. She led armies through fire. She won battles that no one believed could be won. She stood before her accusers, alone, in chains, facing death, and she did not waver. She did not deny what she knew to be true. And in the end, though they burned her body, they could not burn what she had done. They could not unbreak the siege of Orleans. They could not uncrown the king she had crowned. They could not erase the battles she had won, the roads she had ridden, the lives she had changed, simply by being who she was. History is full of powerful men, emperors and generals and kings who commanded millions and shaped the world through armies and wealth and inherited authority. Joan of Arc had none of that. What she had was something rarer and perhaps more powerful, an absolute refusal to be less than what she believed she was called to be. And for that, the world has never forgotten her name.
If you have stayed with this story until this very moment, through the fields of Domrémy, through the fire of Orleans, through the darkness of Rouen, then you are exactly the kind of person this story was made for. Thank you, not just for your time, but for your curiosity, your willingness to sit with history in all of its complexity and beauty and tragedy. Joan of Arc was not a legend invented for comfort. She was a real human being who lived, fought, suffered, and died, and whose story, 6 centuries later, still has the power to move us, to challenge us, and to remind us of what one person, driven by conviction, is capable of doing in the world. The best is yet to come. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in our journey through the ancient world, because the stories that await are just as extraordinary as this one, perhaps even more so. Stay with us. History is never finished.